Hello, welcome to the third week of the Storybook Test Bootcamp program. I'm Kyle, and this week we're going to be discussing component tests. Now, component tests are kind of the heart and soul of Storybook tests. A lot of the testing types that you can perform with Storybook tests are built on top of component tests. So what do I mean by that term? It's kind of a growing term in the industry, and the way that we define it is it's a test where you render a component in the browser, a real web browser, for high fidelity in your testing. You simulate a user interacting with your actual UI, similar to an end-to-end test would, and then it only tests a unit or a single component of that UI, and it can reach into the implementation to mock things or manipulate data, similar to a unit test. So it's kind of like a blend of the best parts of an end-to-end test and a unit test, and it does it in a real browser with your UI components. And that blend makes it perfect for testing complex UI that has a lot of behavior that you want to ensure works as you're doing your development. So let's walk through the component testing guide that we just published. So if you're part of this program, you likely have already done this, but a lot of what I'm going to show depends on our brand new test add-on. So this is just instructions to get started with it there. And then here's what it looks like to actually write a component test. So up through here, this is just kind of a typical component story format or CSF file where you're defining your metadata for what component you're going to render, and then you've got a basic story here that just doesn't do anything. And then to make it a component test where we simulate behavior and like make some assertions like a regular test would be, we add what we call the play function to that story. So here we have another story, filled form, and we've got the play function here. And that play function is what allows you to simulate behaviors like typing in this text field, typing in a password field, clicking the login button. And then you can assert on things like, did the success state appear? Or was the callback for on submit called when the login button was clicked? That's what you're seeing in that animation there. So before I go farther, let me show you a different example in an actual running storybook. So I've got that running here. Oh, here we go. I've got that running here. Here's the empty form story that doesn't have any sort of play function. Then here's a filmed form story, and this is the same one that was just in that document. And so you can see you've got here, and when you do a play function and you've got this component test add-on panel, you can interactively debug or just kind of preview what's going on. So I'm going to go to the start of that, and then I'm going to go step by step. So first we're going to fill out that email form, then we're going to fill out the password, then we're going to click the login button, and now we have an error. Well, let's see what that's about. So it's telling me that it is unable to find an element with the text. Everything is perfect. Your account is ready, and we should probably get you started. Well, I think that's in the success state. So let's go see what's going on. So I've got my login form component here from Shad CDN UI, and I just added some very basic state here and whether or not it's been submitted. And when the login button is clicked, it handles that, and it should be setting submit to true, but I forgot to change something I was doing while I was debugging this. So let's change that. We'll just rerun this here. Aha. Yeah, that was it. So you can see how this provides a visual representation of what you're testing. And so it makes it really straightforward to find the problem, confirm that it works, confirm your fix, etc. So let's look at what that test actually looks like. So here I've got my stories file for this login form. I've got my play function. It's an async function because, as we're going to see, there's lots of things that need to be awaited as you're doing stuff. So And that play function has a object parameter that contains, for now, let's stick with the canvas. So it contains a canvas. And so we're going to use a utility called user event, which we get from the Storybook Test package. So we're going to user event.type, which is going to simulate typing into that form field. So we're going to .type, we're going to type into the element found by querying the canvas for the element with the label text of email. And then we're going to type in email@provider.com. And so if I click forward, we'll see that's exactly what happens. Now, user event is coming from testing library's user event package. It's a direct proxy. We just kind of instrument it so that it works in this add-on panel here. Canvas is a testing library element, and so you get all of the query methods that testing library allows. So like get by label text, find by role, etc. And then, well, I haven't gotten to expect yet. So user event.type, we're going to do that 2 times. So we type into the email field, we type into the password field with a random password. And then finally, we user event.click on the button that has the name login. So we're going to do that. And so that brought up our success state. And now I'm going to make some assertions using expect. Now, expect comes from vtest. And then it has what are called matchers, which are the methods you use to assert things on what you're expecting. And the matchers come from vtest itself, but also testing library has a really excellent matching library called JestDom that adds really useful ones like this to be in the document. And so we're going to find this element by its text. Everything is perfect. Your account is ready, etc. in the canvas. And we're going to expect that that element is in the document. So like, is it just in the DOM of what we're testing? And then we're also going to assert that this onSubmit callback was called. Now to explain that one, I'm going to have to go back up here. So remember in a story, you configure it by passing args, which are the props or the configuration that your component accepts. And so in this case, I passed an onSubmit arg, and I passed it this function call. Now function is another thing that comes from Storybook Test. And it comes from vtest, and it's how you mock a function that can be spied on. So I'm just going to pass an arbitrary mock function here to my onSubmit callback. And what that allows me to do is in my play function, I can get args from this object parameter here, and then I can use args.onSubmit, and that's a spy. So I can then assert on things like, has it been called? So that's exactly what I did. I expected args.submit to have been called. And if I go through those 2 assertions here, there it is in the document. And there it is. It's been called. And just to confirm that, if I comment out the fact that we call the onSubmit prop and rerun it, there you go. Expected onSubmit to be called at least once, and it was not. So there's a lot more that component tests can do. Before I get into the complexities of component tests, though, first I want to show you how it interacts with the new Storybook test, because this is really great. So if you expand the testing module down in the Storybook sidebar here, you'll see that component tests are one of the options. And if you run those, so I ran 12 tests, they all passed. I'm going to expand this so you can see, and it added these test indicators in my sidebar. So it's showing that every single story passed. Now I'm going to go make a change so that I get a failure. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to turn on watch mode. Now I'm going to make a change that does a failure. Whoops. And as soon as I save, it'll rerun the relevant tests, so only 2 of them. And now I have a failure. And so if I click on this, and click on component tests, it would take me directly to the component test panel. Might need to rerun it. Yeah, there we go. So you can see how it's really clear to debug even from this context as well. So that's the easiest way to run your component tests. Of course, add-on test runs those through the vtest CLI. It's just doing it kind of behind the scenes for you when you do it in this Storybook UI. And so you can run it through CLI, and then you can do that in CI as well. So let's go back to the guide and walk through some things in a different way. So let's look at that API again. So we've got our play function, and you query the canvas to get elements. And so a query looks like a combination of a type of query and the subject of that query. And so the types are things like get by, query by, find by, or get all by, query all by, find all by. And this just kind of, it kind of changes the behavior for if there's 0, 1, or more than one matches. So you use the correct one for the correct context. It looks a lot more complicated than it is, I promise. And then the subjects are where it gets really interesting. So you combine a type with a subject. So like get by role, for example, which is what I've done here. So canvas.getByRole, I'm finding the first element with a button role, and then you can pass it some additional options like what accessible name does it have, which is just the text of the button. And so login. So that ensures that I find the login button and not another one. So you can find things by their accessible role, by their label text, by their placeholder text, by their actual visible text, by the display value. So like for inputs, text areas, or select elements that can have a value, you can find it by that, by alt text for images, by the title attribute. And then finally, if none of those work for you, you can do a last resort of by test ID, where you add this data test ID attribute and find it by that. And note that this is an ordered list. That's because we and testing library, where these queries come from, highly encourage you to query by things starting in this order. And that just helps ensure that as you're testing things similar to the way a real user would actually interact with your UI. So for instance, by doing get by role, you're finding things in a way that like users of assistive technology would also be able to find that element. And so it helps ensure that your stuff is usable by the largest, by like a broad range of users and abilities. So we find elements with the canvas and those queries, and then we simulate behavior with user event. This also comes from testing library, and it's got a bunch of methods. I kind of document some of the commonly used ones here. So you can click, you can double click, you can hover, you can simulate a tab press, you can type into an element, you can simulate any sort of keyboard event like the shift key, for example. You can choose an option or multiple options from a select. You can deselect, and finally you can clear any text inside of an input. And there's more, but these are commonly used. And so over here, what I've done is I've done user event.type a couple times, and then I've done a user event.click to click my login button. I'd say those are probably the two most common. But this is how you simulate your user behavior. And notice I'm awaiting these. That helps ensure that they show up correctly as individual line items here in my component test interactive debugger. So you'll always await user events, and you always await expect, which is what's next. So expect, like I said, is the function you use to make assertions, to just check that things you expect to be there or you expect to happen are in fact there or have happened. And there's a lot of methods on expect. And a lot of those come from vtest itself, but then a lot of them also come from testing libraries just DOM. Some of the more common ones, again, are documented here. So you can expect things to be in the document or to be visible, to be disabled. You can expect a function to have been called, or a function to have been called with, where you can assert what the function was actually passed when it was called. And then finally, the last piece of API here that I want to cover is this fn utility, which is just a proxy of vtests, fn, which is helps you mock functions that can then be spied on. And so, yeah, usually in the context of a story, the way that's going to happen is you're going to pass a call to fn to an arg, like on submit in this case. And then down in your play function, you're going to take that arg's argument there of the function, and you're going to find the arg you're interested in on that and expect on that things like to have been called or to have been called with. So that's the general API of component tests. There are some specialized use cases. Component testing is just like all other testing. There's a lot of different needs and complications depending on what you need to test and how your code is structured. And so we've tried to provide a number of things for that. So for example, there's a way to run some arbitrary code. Like in this case, we're setting a mock date so that if our code depended on a date time, it is consistent as we're testing, which is really important. And so this is a way to run some arbitrary code before the story is actually rendered. Or you can create mock data. So in this case, we're using something called subpath imports, which is a node standard used in your package.json. And we'll be covering a lot more of this next week when we talk about mocking techniques. But for now, just know it's a way to provide a mocked package or module. And so we're providing this mocked DB module. And then down here, we are creating a new note with that data. And then what we're doing is we're actually passing that note ID to our page component here so that it will render with that mocked note data. And that's a really powerful platform because it allows you to test consistently mocked data that isn't changing as you change your code. And then there's also a couple of kind of helper properties on stories. There's a before all and a before each. So before each, as the name suggests, runs before each of your stories. And so if you want to mock the date again, but do this for every story in the file, you would do before each in your meta, which affects every story. And here you can go ahead and run in any arbitrary code. So we're going to set the date to that date. And then when you return a function, that's going to run after every story. So it kind of sort of functions like an after each. And so there we're just going to reset the mock date back to what it would be naturally. And so this is just a nice clean way of ensuring that your stories have a clean slate as they're tested. And then before all is the way to do that sort of operation, but for every single story in your project. So if you have some kind of like a init function that you need to call for your project to be bootstrapped and every single story requires that, you can use before all in your preview configuration to apply that to every story. Okay. And then one other small bit of API is you can also destructure this step function from your play function and then wrap individual interactions or assertions in a step with a name. And then that will just display like this in the add-on panel where you get nice collapsible steps where it kind of groups each set of interactions. And so for like a complex play function with lots of elements to it, that can be helpful to keep things organized. I already said you can run your component test in the Storybook UI. You also run it in the CLI. So, for instance, if your package had this test Storybook script, which just runs vtest with the Storybook workspace, then you just do npm run test Storybook, and that will ultimately run vtest, but restricted to the Storybook project, which is just going to take your stories, transform them into vtest tests, and then run them through vtest, and that in a real browser that's powered by Playwright. And that's exactly what's happening when you run it in the Storybook UI. It just kind of happens all behind the scenes. But since it all works in CLI, doing it in CI is the same thing. You really just run this command, or rather this command, in your CI environment instead of your local machine, and that's the only difference. There's another benefit from using VTest for all of this, and that's their editor extensions. So VTest has extensions for like VS Code or JetBrains, and so by testing your stories with add-on test, you can also use the editor extension if you prefer to work more in VS Code to do your debugging. I actually already went through how to debug in the add-on panel there. One thing worth noting though is that because Storybook is a web app and they have URLs, if you publish your Storybook, you get URLs that you can share with your collaborators whenever there's like a test failure that you need some help on, for example. That's an underrated feature of Storybook, I think, where you can share a URL to just about any state, including a failing test. Oh, the page crashed. There we go. All right, and then yeah, as I said, automating is just a matter of calling the CLI in a CI environment. We actually have an entire guide for testing in CI that launched last week. And so I will just direct you to that because there's some details there. And then, yeah, that's basically it. A lot of the other things that we cover here. So let's go back to our schedule. So next week is going to be mocking best practices. A lot of what we do there is going to be to enable component tests, kind of like I showed here. Coverage depends on the component tests. Visual test is a different thing, but accessibility tests also depend on component tests. So yeah, it's kind of the foundation of the testing experience in Storybook. And so I hope this quick overview was useful, and let us know if you have any questions. I'm going to put the document I just walked over, I'll put a link to that down in the description, and hope to see you throughout the bootcamp. Have a great rest of your week.